everywhere welcome Mr. Isaac R. Caswell for his lecture on protecting languages, preserving culture, spotlight on Sanskrit, under Ireland India Friendship Lecture Series. Sanskrit is believed to be languages of gods, and is either the source or inspiration to many modern languages. We appreciate the efforts of Mr. Isaac R. Caswell for helping to include Sanskrit to Google Translate. With his reports, Mr. Caswell's report, Sanskrit will now be easily accessible as a language to millions of users all over the world, which will not only help it survive but also make it popular. Mr. Caswell is a research scientist at Google Translate, where he has worked since 2017. His work focuses on adding new languages to the service, as well as improving translation quality of lower resource languages, specifically the languages of India. He has a BS in symbolic systems, including linguistics, from Stanford University, and a MS in computer science, that is artificial intelligence, also from Stanford. Isaac grew up in Northern California and has proficiency in German, Spanish, French, Irish, and additionally has some familiarity with Hindi, Telugu, and Chinese. His main free time activity is Carnatic singing, which he has studied since 2016 with Srimati Jayasri Varadarajan and Sri Ramlalita Kalamandir School of Fine Arts, and has additionally been involved in Stanford Agapella for the last 12 years. He currently resides in Palo Alto with his cat and enjoys the wonders of natural mountains. We shall listen more from Mr. Caswell on his journey in bringing Sanskrit to Google Translate portal. Before that, I request Mr. Caswell for his lecture. I request His Excellency Ambassador for the introductory remarks on the process.
Namaskar. First of all, very warm welcome to all of you. It's a special privilege for me to welcome multifaceted genius Isaac Caswell. And also let me express my sincere thanks to my young friend Ash Singh, who was instrumental in connecting us and making this possible. I also acknowledge with appreciation and gratitude the presence of Sri Rutgerji, who was recently conferred Padma Shri, one of the top Government of India awards for his pioneering work in teaching Sanskrit in Ireland. And also very delighted to welcome another very genius, multifaceted talent, Kaushik Chandrasekharji, who is the Managing Director of Google Maps. Very warm welcome. Thank you. Friends, while India is celebrating 75 years of its independence, we call Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav, the inclusion of Sanskrit in Google translation is the best gesture from Google Tech community to India and to the people of India. Particularly as Ambassador of India to Ireland, I am extremely delighted to see the Irish connection. And I applaud the pioneering personal effort of dear friend Isaac Caswell, his intellectual leadership in making this possible. So this event is also in a way to say thank you Galway, thank you Ireland for this inspiring development. Friends, for India, Sanskrit is not a mere language in the sense of being a medium of communication, but the life breath of our ancient nation. The foundation, the palimpsest on which India's culture, India's civilization, India's philosophy, its uniquely pluralistic and inclusive worldview developed. It is Sanskrit which first envisioned our motherland's sacred natural identity from the Himalayas to the oceans. As Rigveda says, yes ye me himovanto matitva, yes samudram rasaya sahapu. Or as Kalidas says, asit talasyam dish devatatma himalayo namanagaadhiraja. It is Sanskrit which contains the seed of India's ingrained ethos of democracy, of secularism, pluralism, and also scientific excellence, which accords primacy to quest of knowledge rather than acceptance of dogmas and beliefs. Friends, normally we only see the branches, the leaves, flowers, not the seed. In Sanskrit, there is a beautiful line which says, Jaten kure katham hopalabheta bijam. Once the seed has germinated, then where do you find the seed? But friends, if we think, pause and contemplate on the reality, then we do realize the connection between the seed and the fruit. Today, unfortunately, Sanskrit is no longer a pervasively spoken language, but its underlying influence can be felt everywhere in India, from Kashmir to Kanyakumari, from east to west. And it's like enduring web which unifies the incredible diversity of India into one single construct. Friends, it is for India, as I mentioned, it's a very, very significant role that Sanskrit has played. But what is the importance of Sanskrit for the world, for the rest of the world? Firstly, Sanskrit is inherently a universal language. It does not belong to any specific geographical region, unlike most other languages in India and also outside. But through its very unique linguistics, its Devanagari script, and very huge body of literature which touches upon every aspect of human life and human experience, it has influenced and shaped languages, literatures, cultures all over India and also many parts of the world. If I look at the defining features, the unique aspects of Sanskrit linguistics, firstly, it strikes me that Sanskrit is originally vocal, inherently phonetic. It's not symbolic. It's not about symbols that we read and see. It originated, as we believe, from the sound of Shiva's Damaru, and therefore it is more profoundly connected with the musical, the sound instrument, rather than paper and pen. Secondly, because of its deep connection with the sound and the science of sound, the arrangement of letters, akshara or varnamala, is also based on very deep, very profound understanding of the science of sound, the music, speech, and the vocal system of human being. The vowels and consonants are very neatly separated and arranged in a very precise scientific order, somewhat like Mendelev's periodic table of elements, but predating several centuries. In most other languages, the arrangement of alphabets is quite random. For example, in English, it's A, B, C, D, E. There is no particular reason. Mr. Caswell might correct me, he's a linguist. As per my understanding, there is no particular reason why it should be A, B, C, D, E. In Greek, for example, we have alpha, beta, delta, gamma. In Arabic, we have alif, be, te, se, jim, he. In Persian, we have alif, be, te, pe, se. There does not seem to be a particular reason, rationale why the alphabets are arranged in this particular manner. Whereas in Sanskrit, there is a very profound science behind it. Also, the 14 Maheshwara Sutra, the rhythmic sound patterns coming out of Shiva's Damaru, not only contain the order of letters, the alphabets, but also the fundamentals of entire linguistics of Sanskrit. And that has given this language incredible stability and resilience of structure. And because of that, the Sanskrit vocabulary and language has essentially remained unchanged since Panini, more than 2005 years since. Unlike English, for example, to give an example, even if you read 200-year-old prose or poetry, it seems quite archaic, and the language has changed so much in a couple of centuries. Also, friends, the structure of Sanskrit is such that with 3 persons, 3 genders, 8 cases, 10 tenses, and the concept of sandhi and samas, it creates an incredibly rich and multi-dimensional space in which most, if not all, languages can be accommodated within its rubric, its umbrella. And personally, I myself benefited from very elementary knowledge of Sanskrit while I was learning foreign languages like Spanish or Italian or Persian or Arabic. With very little knowledge of Sanskrit structure, I found it very easy to pick up any language. And I'm very confident that someday, like Mr. Caswell, I also speak Irish. Friends, bringing Sanskrit into Google Translation is very significant development because it will create much wider global consciousness about the contemporary relevance of Sanskrit language as a unifying thread connecting languages all over the world. Secondly, it will expand and make easy access to the wealth of wisdom and knowledge and joy that the Sanskrit literature contains for the universal brotherhood, happiness, harmony, health for all. In the real spirit of the message of Sanskrit, Sarve Bhadrani Pashyantu Ma Kaschit Dukkha Bhag Bhavi. Now friends, once again, it's a great privilege for me and my colleagues in the embassy to welcome you all on this weekend. We are very touched, and let me invite a very warm welcome to Mr. Caswell to share his thoughts. We are very delighted that you could spare time for us in a very short visit that you are taking to Ireland this time. Thank you.
Sarvebhyo Namaha. Imam Sabham Sambodhaitum Artam Gauravam Anubhavam. Anubhavam. Amantrinaya Rajadut Nahodaya Samagate Yashcha Sarvebaha Dhanyavadaha Samartya. Dear colleagues, it's nooit more een Jesse bezig om nou te doen. Vooral weer als er wel lessen was Deutsch, als er kwijt een hoorstom luister te doen. Als ik er maar een beetje als so. For those of you who didn't understand all of that, essentially, thank you. It's a great honor to be here. I thank the ambassador for inviting me, and I thank all of you for coming today. So, how does this menu go? Okay, so before I start, a little explanation of this first slide here. I have Goddess Saraswati, the Hindu goddess of knowledge, wisdom, and music, and I have the goddess Bridget, the pre-Christian pagan Irish god of basically the same things. And both of them have their festivals in the beginning of spring. And actually, in 2017, it would have been a good day to give this address because the Vasanta, Pantami, and Imbolc were on the same day on February 1st that year. Soon it will happen again, I'm sure. So, today, a brief overview of what I'll talk about. First, at this point, I guess there's already been a lot of introduction of myself, but I do have some slides, so I'll give a little more introduction and explain why it is that I'm talking to you. And then I'll be talking overall about some of the significance of Sanskrit, but more specifically of its inclusion in Google Translate. Now, I got preempted here a bit, so I'm not sure how much I can add to this, but I'll say a bit more at least. I'll also talk a bit more about the connections between the Irish language and culture and the Indian culture and Sanskrit language. And finally, I'll wrap up by talking about a bit how the machine learning model worked that we trained, and what we can expect from it currently and in the future. So again, I'll skip over this very quickly because I think everything was already said about me, basically. But the only sort of other thing I'd mention is, although now I work mainly on adding new languages to the product, I used to, in the past couple of years, I worked on improving the quality of translation for Hindi and the Dravidian languages. So they're still not great, but they're much better than they were a couple of years ago. And then personal introduction of some pictures. I grew up in Northern California, that's my home in the upper right. And I family here in Galway, and started learning Irish language and traditional music in 2010. You can see here playing curling as well. The a cappella group I was in college, which is an Indian a cappella group, and that eventually led me to the study of Carnatic classical music, which is partially in Sanskrit. So that was an exposure to language to start with. My tiny little picture of seeds up here is to symbolize my connection to the Andhra culture in the Bay Area. This is just some toasted papua that I made some kurapuri from a couple weeks ago. So, now, what is it that we're talking about? What is this launch of Google Translate, new languages to Google Translate? Well, it's what I've been working on for the past couple of years. We did it on May 11th, so less than a month ago. And of the 24 new ones that we added, 8 of them were Indian, including Sanskrit, but also including some other major languages like Konkani, Bhojpuri, Maithili, Dogri, and languages in the Northeast as well. Shaded here on the map. And we have a nice paper out as well. You can check it out if you want to. So, now for some background on 2 languages. So, handily enough, by the way, my uncle is a professor in medieval Irish history here in NUI Galway. So, since I was staying with him the last week, I got to talk to him a bit about some of this. So, some fun stuff to share. To start with, I'm sure you'd all agree with this. Language is the foundation of culture. There's this nice Irish saying, Tír gan teanga, tír gan anam. A country without a language is a country without a soul, by Patrick Bridge. So, as you've already heard, as I'm sure all of you know, Sanskrit is a deeply important part of Indian and especially Hindu culture, although it goes beyond just Hinduism. And all of you who are familiar with Ireland will also know that Irish plays a very deep, important role in the Irish culture. Although I will say, if you're only familiar with the importance of Irish or other languages, I've never, as a material, can hardly be overemphasized how important Sanskrit is to the Hindu and Indian identity. Language is important to all cultures, but if you see the devotion with which people treat Sanskrit, there's really, I don't know if there's any other language like it which inspires such devotion in its followers. Nonetheless, Irish is of course very important to its people too, like my own family. And they have a lot of similarities. One that I'll at least mention here is that they both struggled under colonial countries for a long time, for hundreds of years. In fact, yeah, since the last 500 years at least, both of them have been under the yoke of colonialism of both the offshore island and also like Mongols in the case of India, and the Romans in the case of Ireland. So, why do we add it? I mean, there are a lot of reasons. I just have a couple bullet points here. But the first one is that people wanted it. So, over the last many years, we always have people saying, add my language to Google Translate. We want this language. And one language that stood out from the rest of them as being the most requested, and that is Sanskrit. The requests are everything from professors, everyday people, to students saying, can you add it this weekend? I have a test on Monday. I don't think they quite understood the work that goes into it, but a lot of requests. Another thing, though, is why would people want it? There's a couple reasons. One of them is to add the sense of recognition from the tech giant for this language. So, one of my Sanskrit-speaking colleagues at Google said that he thought of it sort of like Sanskrit is like the river Saraswati, and you think of it, it's underground right now. The river's strong, but it's not visible. And with things like this, it will gush up to the minds of the common people. He said, in a sense, it becomes more real of the world as it becomes included in more technologies. So there's that aspect of simply the fact that it's there, whether or not it actually translates well, is important. Although, for me, of course, it's very important that it does translate well. So that's where my job comes in. The second part, which I'll talk more about later, is it's a tool. It's an important tool for learning the language, learning about the immense treasure trove of Vedic and Sanskrit language that's out there. And other sort of analytic scholarship you can also do with this. Translation is a tool you can do a lot of things with it, turns out. So, I hate to condense thousands of years to one slide, which is a brief introduction for those of you who aren't quite as familiar with Sanskrit. And we've got so much here, of course, just a couple bullet points. It has one of the oldest literatures of new language in the world, dating back to about 1500 BCE. It's very hard to date. And it has some of the earliest works in linguistics as well, like the texts by Barnaby, who you mentioned already, which influences current linguistics as well. For instance, many linguistic terms are in Greek and Latin in the Western world. However, you'll notice that terms like Sandi are just used in English when speaking about other languages because they're taken from these old treatises. It's of course learned by many people, millions of people worldwide, and it's still used not so much for speaking, although there are some places like the Matu village in Karnataka. But it's mainly not spoken, but it is important in a lot of contexts. For instance, it's a liturgical language. It's used in religious contexts, and in the context that I'm involved in singing. There's still many songs in Sanskrit language, and even many more recent songs. So there's rock and roll and even metal now in Sanskrit as people adapted to today's world. There are a couple varieties. So there's Vedic Sanskrit, which is the oldest variety known. There's actually a couple regional varieties of it, which I don't know the details about. They do exist. And then there's Classical Sanskrit, which is from around 1,000, 2,000 years ago. So, very new. And that's the variety that Google Translate is supporting, and that's the main one that you'll learn if you're learning a language in school. And it's a new European language. There are some influences from local languages on it, for instance, the Munda languages, but also a lot of influence from the Dravidian languages, which some people credit the retroflex consonants to. And also, many words that you all know, like Varika, Palan, those are actually originally Dravidian words that were picked up. And, as you all know if you've tried to learn it, has a complex grammar, it's highly effective, and maintains many grammatical features of this Proto-European language, which are not present in a lot of other languages. Now, I'm going to do the same thing and compress all of the languages to one slide. You'll notice that some of the bullet points are sort of similar. So, there's a long scholarly history. It's the oldest vernacular literature in Western Europe. And actually, the oldest written Irish texts are older than the oldest written Sanskrit texts. Although the Sanskrit texts like the Vedas are dated much earlier, they are transmitted orally. So the early surviving written texts for Irish are a little bit older. The language, Old Irish flourished around the year 600 AD, and then Middle Irish came after that, and there's Modern Irish after this. And as you also may all know, it was outlawed by the Britishers who were colonizing and led immense damage to the language for a long time. But it still is alive and strong, and like Sanskrit, there's more learners than ever. If any of you are doing Duolingo, Duolingo always pops up this thing that says there are more learners of Irish than there are Irish speakers. I think this is mainly from the US. There's a lot of Irish Americans who care a lot about their heritage, and they're all trying to learn this. And I guess I'm a lucky one who actually has family who speaks Irish here in Ireland, so it's easier for me. There's many, sort of unlike Sanskrit, which at this point is more just the one dialect, the classical Sanskrit. There's many different spoken dialects in Irish, the three main ones and various sub-dialects. Then there's a highly complex grammar, sound familiar? Highly inflecting, and many grammatical features of Proto-European. So these are the historical dialects. This is the Westhoff today, the region where Irish is still a primary language, just little regions, as I say, beyond the pale, beyond the English influence. So, now a couple more notes about this whole Indo-European idea. So scholars have worked on this for many years. Indo-European is the best constructed proto-language, but still is a lot of guesswork. All of this is the best guesses of scholars, but you can have your own truth as you look at the evidence. But I'll present the ideas of the scholars at least here. So all Indo-European languages, ranging from the far west would be Ireland and Iceland to the far east would be India, are postulated to have descended from this one Proto-Indo-European language, which was spoken somewhere around 6,000 years ago, maybe longer ago, around the region where present-day Afghanistan is. It's a little unclear, but somewhere in the general region. And then there's this big migration, somewhere around 4,000 years ago, 4 to 6,000 years ago. And they migrated all over Europe, and Iran, and India. And then you have, on the very edge of the Indo-European sphere, you have Ireland, the far west, India, the far right, east, sorry. And these are known as peripheral regions. And an interesting thing is, there are a lot of exceptions to this, but it tends to be the case that in regions of migration, the peripheral regions are the ones which are more conservative, meaning they conserve features of the older language. So the languages in the center of like the Slavic languages, say, in the center of the Indo-European domain, have evolved much more from the proto-language. But the languages at the edge, like Old Irish, Sanskrit, also Latvian, Armenian, Icelandic, those ones just on the edge of the sphere maintain more of these old features. So that's already a connection between these two languages. And there's also a lot of interesting cultural connections. You can read about it in your free time, but I put some fun bullet points here. There's this bardic tradition of transmitting the oral works in verse which some people postulate is sort of the original Indo-European way of transmitting knowledge. So you have the most important parts of these verses, you know, the Veda it's mostly in verse, you have the polyglot learning Irish epics mostly in verse. At least all the important parts are in verse, and what people say are in verse. Then there are prose bits surrounding them. The sense is that the prose isn't so important, it's sort of the vessel for the verse. And you have this priestly class, which in Old Ireland would be the Druids, in India would be the Brahmins, who learn these texts by rote and they're passed on. And it takes, in your education might take 20 years, and you learn it all and you pass it on. There's also this one really fun little note here. It's very specific, but it's I'll pass it on because it's very specific. In Old Irish law, there's a lot of Old Irish laws on writing. There's this rule that if someone owes you a debt, you can basically go into the doorstep and fast, not eat any food or drink any water, and the person whose doorstep it is legally obligated also to fast until they've either resolved the debt or gone to court with you. It's an interesting thing too because it sort of brings the poor people on same levels to high people because anyone can fast. And if the person doesn't fast, then you have a legal case against them for breaking that law, right? And this is also something from Old Hindu law, at least very, very similar. I don't know as much of the details there. But this is something where you don't imagine it would just spring up, right? Like, this is an ancient Indo-European law, presumably survived up until not quite the modern day, I think, but it's a little bit before the modern day. So there's some cultural similarities at a glance. Also on the side, I won't go too much into this, but there's a lot of confusion about what it means for a language to be old, because if they all descended from the same proto-language, in a sense, aren't they all the same age? And I would say, yes, all spoken languages, you could say, are the same age, whatever that means. But we do talk about things in terms of how conservative they are in linguistics, and how many of the features of the proto-language they conserve. And also you have a language like Sanskrit, which is sort of a snapshot in time, or Old Irish, it's a snapshot in time. So then, since that snapshot, it hasn't grown on. I thought I'd include this in part just because of this beautiful diagram of the Indo-European languages. So, anyways, that's my brief overview of everything cultural linguistic. Now I'll talk at a high level about what it took technically to get this language onto Google Translate. So, first question, some people say, about time. And if you say that, well, perhaps you've forgotten how recent technology is. Machine translation is really hard, as you can imagine, translating things properly. In the 80s and 90s, people had teams of linguistic experts, and they made all these rules, and the translation quality was terrible, even for the easiest languages. And neural machine translation, just in 2016, we forget how recent it is, made gigantic jumps. For those of you who remember Google Translate before 2015, it was sort of comical. Now it's still sometimes comical, but for the higher resource languages, it generally gets things about right. But still, there's a lot that the technology has not gotten to yet. And typically, to train a translation model, you need hundreds of millions, or at the minimum tens of millions, or crores, of translated sentences for the model to learn off. So these are sentences that humans have translated. And if you want to do the math of how long it would take to get humans to translate all that, it's a long time. It's not really feasible to do. Like, you just sort of have to wait for those translations to appear for you. So this is the reason why, up until this year, there was a very limited set of languages that we could support. We would have loved to support more, but it just was not possible at all. And so languages like Sanskrit, which had fewer resources online, they're called lower resource, meaning only that there are fewer resources that a machine learning model can train on, not that there are fewer absolute resources. These languages were really impossible to translate well. Also, at this bullet point, a lot of people would say, well, aren't there all the epics, they've all been translated, right? I'm sure with the ideal technology that would be enough, but with the technology where it was, that was not enough data, and also they have their own issues with the way they're translated and so on. So, up until this year, it's not possible, but we have an advance. So, recently, that is to say, over the last 2 years, we kind of became public with it. We developed a technology called zero-resource machine translation. Zero resource in this case just means that there are no examples of translated sentences. So this machine learning model has seen its hundreds of millions of translated sentences for the higher resource languages, so it sees Spanish translated English, Hindi translated English, and so on. But it has never seen any examples of Sanskrit translated English. And actually, we give it data in 1,000 different languages where there are no translations. And after training for many weeks on this gigantic amount of data, this very large multilingual model, it actually learns to translate these languages where it's never seen translations. And so at first blush, you may think this is impossible. And in fact, when we first started working on it, I really did not expect it to work very well at all. But it worked much better than expected. And I guess the metaphor you could think about is, imagine you're this extreme polyglot. You speak 100 different languages. And then you get to sit down with a stack of texts, a stack of novels, and you have all the time in the world just to read through them, pour through them, find connections, look for cognates. If you think about it that way, there's a lot you could do if you were a brilliant person and you had all the time in the world. And so that's basically what the model does. It doesn't do it perfectly, and there are some things it can't tease apart from context. But in general, it's quite good. Okay, I have a bit of a note here. I'm sure all of you are wondering in what ways might Sanskrit be special or not special. I would say it is more difficult than the average language to translate, but there's also more text available for it. So there are the long compounds and the complex grammar system with 8 cases. This is definitely not easy for the model. And also there's the issue of this, what we call narrow domain, meaning that a lot of the text that there is out there is religious in nature or about very specific things. And even to this day, if you try to translate into Google, with Google Translate, like, change my password, please, like, is there a Sanskrit word for password? Well, maybe, but but yeah, one of the things still are just very difficult to translate to Sanskrit. There's also, as I said, the mix in the data of the Vedic Sanskrit, the classical Sanskrit, and what I call student Sanskrit. In other words, Sanskrit spectrum language, which has been produced by people who don't speak the language very well. This is all mixed in, so that also complicates the task. But I will say, at least there is a fair amount of data. It has a nice rule-following grammar, and there are a lot of descendants of it, so the model has more to work off of. So it's not as hard as some languages, like the Native American languages, whose grammar is actually even more complex, and they have fewer languages related to them, and there are more dialects in them. So that's my small side here. And finally, a list of people who helped out here. So basically, I just emailed a whole bunch of lists at Google, Indians in Mountain Dew or something, saying, does anyone speak Sanskrit and want to help me out with this project? And a lot of people responded very enthusiastically. I'll notice, by the way, you may see some of Pichai, he didn't help out, he just did the other guy's profile picture. But yeah, some of these people are teachers of Sanskrit or scholars in various ways, and they were very helpful. The most important thing that they did in general was helping evaluate the model. So I would train a model, say, look, produce these translations. According to the automatic metric, this is nonsense. What you say, and they're like, no, this is good, the automatic metric is wrong. We worked through things like this. And we also helped with some filtering of data. So, now moving on to, what can you expect from Google Translate Sanskrit? Is it fluid? Short answer, no. So, first of all, though, how should you think of it? So this is my opinion, of course. I mean, everything's my opinion, of course. I'm not Google, I'm a research scientist at Google, but this is my opinion about Google Translate. It's a very useful tool. For some things, I would actually change for many things. But I will say, it is just a tool. Google Translate cannot replace learning a language. Even if it were perfect, even if it captured all the nuance of the language, that does not mean that you should not learn the language, because learning a language is swimming in the Jnana Sagar, the ocean of knowledge. That's of course being a word I learned from songs. It's the ocean of knowledge, it's the literature you can read in that language only. Like, and Muslims often say that you can't understand the Quran unless you learn Arabic. I can't speak to this because I don't speak Arabic, but it's the same idea. The language itself, it broadens the way you think and it opens new worlds for you. And if anything, I would say that Sanskrit support of Google Translate makes it more important for humans and human experts to learn it. So another fun little side, in German the word for vocabulary is Wortschatz, which literally means the word treasure. So I just included some fun snippets from my favorite Irish dictionary, the Great Deneen. And these are not cherry-picked, I just flipped open and found some fun words maybe for the B section. And it's this beautiful dictionary, this piece of cultural heritage, where this guy just went out to all these villages and learned all these words from them. And every entry you can sort of see what the culture there is like. A cow or beast of trespassing propensities, and the grass that cannot be cut with the scythe and must be cut with a reaping hook. A cake made of curds of sour milk and baked in a griddle. Like, this is, it doesn't matter how good Google Translate is, right? You have to get this by learning the language. But Translate can be a tool. So, start with strengths of the model. It's pretty good at translating into English. And it's, to my surprise actually, it's pretty good at even behaving Sanskrit, which is older and more sort of ambiguous, I guess. And so this is just someone on Twitter just trying it out. And they apparently believe it's a pretty good translation. You also notice how the English translation is always much longer, because Sanskrit is so dense. I think I've also seen tweets where people are saying it doesn't work so well in Vedic Sanskrit, but at least it does okay, surprisingly. And it's also generally good going into Sanskrit for longer sentences. So it does, in all directions, it gives you a good approximation. And it can be a really good rough idea of what's going on. And it can even be useful for, say, translation, where people do what's called post-editing. They get a first translation of a model and then they edit it to be correct. There are, of course, weaknesses. So one weakness currently, which I'm currently working on fixing, is it turns out it sometimes actually just produces Hindi on very short inputs, or when it doesn't know a word in Sanskrit, it produces sort of Sanskrit-ified Hindi. So it just takes this Hindi word and puts its ending on, which is, honestly, if it doesn't know a word, it may be the best thing it could do. And then it sometimes struggles with Sandhi. It often does well, but Sandhi can be very complicated. You can have compounds that go on for a whole page, so it's not going to be good at that. And also sometimes it will confuse words that occur in similar contexts. Like maybe the source says purple, but it translates as blue or something like this. So it definitely does have its mistakes, but we are working on it. There's one other thing I want to mention. This is actually true just in general for all languages, not only in Google Translate, but even for human translators. When someone translates from one language to another, the language they produce in the second language is what we call translation needs. So it's perfectly plausible in the language they're translating to, but often it's not quite the way you'd normally say things. Or even if it is quite the way you normally say things, it does bear some imprint from the source language. So I gave some examples in German for one of our research papers. You can see, even if you don't read German, we've highlighted the source is in English, the translation is what a human did. Each chunk of the sentence is in the same location. And this is a perfectly plausible German sentence, it's just slightly different from how you normally say it. And the bottom two, labeled paraphrase, those are more natural sentences produced by a German speaker if they were to produce it without referencing to English, which mean the same thing, but they're sort of reordered. So in the same way, the Sanskrit produced by this model will, to some extent, have this translation needs factor, where it may be not quite the way it would be said natively. And this is true for all languages. Just a thing to be aware of. And it's also getting better. Like this new zero resource technique actually has less translation needs, but it still has its problems. So, what's next? I would say there's nowhere to go but up. So, I can't promise anything soon. These things take a long time, and who knows how fast technology will or won't progress. But I, at least, continue to work to improve this. I don't want to have translation on Google Translate if it's not good. So, it'll only get better. And there are a lot of things to work on that we are working on. And of course, I'm re-emphasizing that this is only a tool. The next step for you all is to start learning more Sanskrit, or Irish, or both. And I've included a nice quote here that I always like. It's Sangeet Jnanamu Bhakti Vinas and Vagnamu Karate Omanasa. So this is, it's Sanskrit-ified Telugu, so it's Telugu but with heavy Sanskrit influence. And it's from a famous song called Sangeet Jnanamu, meaning music, mere music alone, or mere knowledge of music alone, is not enough without devotion aligned. So, music, language, what's the difference really? The idea being that mere knowledge, the jnana you can get from Google Translate, say, it's helpful, but it's not enough. You have to have the devotion and the love for the language and learning yourself. So, and last, some fun stuff, which is just Twitter reaction. Mostly positive, people saying some funny things, like now the gods don't have to think twice to say what they want to say. Of course, some negative things. This person in the middle noticed that Hindi comes out sometimes, but overall, I was very happy to see it. Also, I only read the English language Twitter, so maybe I don't know what it's like on the Hindi language Twitter. I know some people are probably more edgy about it, but it's something. So, go to my website and so I welcome questions.
How can we help when we are using this? How does it improve the actual machinery? How does it improve? Yes.
So,
It's
current,
possible for us to help you.
yes, to some extent. It's definitely harder to use human contributions than one would expect right now, especially because technology keeps on changing. Maybe we think we can use it this year, but then 2 years later, something comes around that makes it obsolete. But there are definitely ways you can help. So there's two main ways. When you go to Google Translate or translate.google.com, when you get something translated, there's a thumbs up and thumbs down button. And if you know the language well enough to know it's a bad translation, you can do the thumbs down, and then it'll prompt you to say why is it bad, and if you can provide a better one, you can provide a better one. So then it won't immediately make the correction you make, because we have to sort of go over it slowly and somehow incorporate it into some model. It'll gradually go towards the improvement. And also, there's what's called Translate Contribute, which if you go to, again, translate.google.com, under the box, it's like sort of like a sharpie language, there's a little circle with a person icon in it. And you click on that, and it takes you to a page which shows you example translations. You can rate them for good or bad, and you can also provide your own translations that we will then slowly use and incorporate into the model.
As a student of Sanskrit, I go to, that's my area there, but I go to, like we have a verse, and then we go to the dictionary, and we look at the, we get the root word, like ought, and we get ought, and see what that means, uninterrupted flow, and that's the way the study goes. So I'm not a really technical person, although I have a computer and a smartphone and a smart TV, which I can't use. So how, like, for somebody who's gone along in that way, how is this going to help?
So, for using Google Translate as a tool for learning, you have to be very careful just to never completely trust what it says. And as long as you keep that in mind, it can be a source of inspiration, say. So say, you're like, I don't know how to translate this. I wonder what this word is. You can type in your sentence, it can show you something, you can just ignore it. Or you can say, oh yes, this reminds me. Or I could do it this way. I think that as long as you have the facility to verify something, and don't just trust that it must be right, then it can be very useful for showing you potential things. Like say you're looking at some stem, and it's not in whatever dictionary you currently have, or it's some weird stem. You can put it in, it'll show you a canon translation. Maybe you'll be like, I don't think so. Maybe you'll be like, oh yeah, that does seem reasonable. Or perhaps it's even something which scholars don't agree on. They can at least give you an opinion. You're like, well, whatever this means, the machine thinks this. I don't know, there are various ways you can do that. Also, if you just are having trouble typing it or sounding it out, I guess we don't currently have voice to text and text to voice, but those will come hopefully at some point. So there are a suite of other tools that are incorporated into Google Translate products. I hope that helps.
And is it, sorry, one more question, the Google Translate, is it just written, or does it sound out to you?
So currently it's just written. That's the first step in adding a language, and then we hope to gradually add more features.
Yeah, just I want to say something. I checked the Google Translate Sanskrit one, and there is no audio there.
Yeah, it's not doing it.
And if we can add that what she said, like if I want to translate go in Sanskrit, so we are saying a gachatu, right? So you just add over there, that is the root word for extra knowledge, if someone needs it. So just add over there, so she can also do that work, so the students also can do more, gain that knowledge from Sanskrit. That's I want. So if you reach the scholars of Sanskrit, kind of, so might be they will help you about that dictionary with that. So I think so. And can you do the transliteration as well with I saw that the Sanskrit is there, the Sanskrit actual script, but no English transliteration. transliteration, which we are doing in our school. So that's just very helpful for the Irish people, the other countries.
I absolutely agree on both points. Those are both things that I'm working on. There's all these different features, and rather than trying to wait until everything's ready and then, a couple of years later put it up, they put it up with the text translation first. But totally agree. For other Indian languages, there is already the transliteration at least, and there are more dictionaries. All these things are harder than they sound. Even just getting a dictionary, there's all this licensing business and so on. So my hope is that this will come in the years to come. I have no idea when, but keep an eye out for it.
Thank you. It's very helpful for our school teachers and the students who's learning Sanskrit as well. Thank you.
I would assume you know that Ashtadhyayi has been digitized fully now. So perhaps there is a option that we can link the two, Google Translate and Ashtadhyayi. Perhaps that way we can solve that problem. Because then we can have all the dhatu roots and connectivity, whatever. Suddenly everything is very clear.
And that's a very huge knowledge. That if you can do, that's fantastic.
Yeah, I would love to. If you, I guess we can connect after this, and I'll see if
Yes,
there's anything.
sure. Yeah, because we are working on it, right? So I can look to
So, what you mentioned is that one of the most important ways in which these ancient languages were used was the transmission of religious knowledge and text. And so I'm curious, when you look at, for example, the Bible, the Bible has been translated over 2,000 years in several different formulations, and some of the translations have very different meanings than other translations. And if you go back and you look at the root Aramaic or Hebrew, you do see that certain words, if you change them in a sentence in the Bible and you change that throughout the story or the parable, it does create quite a different meaning for that philosophy. So I'm just curious, when you are referencing these ancient languages that are derived in religion, how have you managed that in the machine learning, and has that been an issue that you've come up with, where you've seen the human translation that's happened over these past millennia has been, in fact, maybe false or wrong in certain areas, and has it affected the translations that come out at the end of the machine learning?
Great question. Yeah, actually, I read some books on the reconstruction of the original Bible. It's a very interesting study. Trying to figure out what the earliest versions of the Bible really said. There's this delightfully peculiar sort of axiom that if there are two conflicting versions, the one that makes less sense is probably the right one, because people generally change things when they make changes only to make them make more sense. Anyways, that's an aside. So this point definitely comes up a lot for the question of, say, to what extent, so the earliest written records of the Vedas would be in, say, year 1000 or something like this, but they're going to come from 2,500 years earlier at least. So scholars would be able to tell you more the extent to which they believe it was, which things were transmitted without any change, and which things may have changes introduced. So I'm not being learned enough myself, I can't answer about that. However, the Sanskrit that is supported in Google Translate is classical Sanskrit, and that's the one which is flourishing only 1,000, 2,000 years ago. And that's very well preserved. It's an ancient language in the sense that it's old, but it never really thought of use in the sense. And also, unlike a lot of these other languages, there were just these very extensive treatises written about Sanskrit. So you can't really say, well, what did this mean when Manini says, this means this, or something. So in that case, I don't have any fear that, I'm sure there are some cases where the meaning is drifted, but for the most case, I think classical Sanskrit is very well understood, and there's very little ambiguity about what people really meant. Although anyone can correct me here, since I'm not a Sanskritist myself. I don't know if that answered your question. Old Irish is definitely an interesting thing. I remember my aunt and uncle actually met studying Old Irish, and they had, back then, is before they even had dictionaries, they had what are called fascicules. They just word lists that scholars have collected, and many times you don't really know what they're saying. Like, so what is this word here? This fascicule says it's probably this one says probably this. So it's very much a construction. Maybe that's what Vedic scholarship is like, I'm not sure, but classical Sanskrit is more, I think, it's more clear. Oh, you can correct me.
Just a question on your zero resource
did it use, let's say, English as its intermediary translation? Because if you know 100 languages that translate to English and then you translate back, was there something like that, or does it just learn from different languages translating to each other?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Currently it is using English, and so this does introduce some difficulties, some imprecisions, because English lacks a lot of grammatical inflections.
Yeah,
and
that's
so on.
right. The nuances as well.
Yes. However, I did do some experiments which are in the paper showing that direct translation to other languages can be better, especially for Indian languages. So this is one of the many directions that I can explore in gradually improving the model.
Very exciting.
Yes, first of all, great work. I think it's really interesting that you managed to do that. I was intrigued by the section where so you're dog fooding or you're testing the translate, right, with a set of scholars that know Sanskrit. So how does the machine learning model flag it so that you can run it by them, right? Like how is it that you're flagging some sentences that you will go to them and ask, okay, is this right? How's that happening?
Let's see, yes, there's one to two things. The main thing is what we call automatic translation metrics. So we always need to have some signal of about how good a translation model is. And the classic signal has been what's called the BLU score, BLEU, bilingual language understudy something. And it's a very simple metric. It basically says how many, so you have a reference translation produced by a human. Then you say your machine translation, how close is it, as in how many words does it share, how many sets of 2 words does it share, how many sets of 3 words, and so on. People have been complaining about this metric for years, and it still has never died because it's been so ingrained in the community. And for our work, it finally did die, and Sanskrit is a great example, because if you're looking at word overlap, and Sanskrit words are long, you're likely going to get close to 0 at all times, right? Unless you get exactly the same as whatever the human person did. So that's it. But now we're using more of a score called char-f, which is similar on a character level. So how many pairs of characters, and you can imagine how if you get a long Sanskrit word approximately right, it'll still be higher. And we actually we had a table in our paper of for which languages does the BLU and character, the word and character-based metrics diverge the most, and Sanskrit is among the most divergent. But yes, that's an approximate metric. Also, sometimes we just would do random samples, like in the very beginning, before we even had those metrics, before we had given translations to compare and say, is this doing anything? Yeah, it's actually, some people were quite shocked. Actually, this is quite grammatical Sanskrit. I was not expecting this. It's very nice because so many people don't know how difficult machine translation is, and they'll be very critical when a language comes out. But the people in Google, they do know. So when something's slightly good, they say it's amazing. And then also sometimes, yeah, that's about it. Well, I suppose if there aren't any more questions, we wrap up.
How did you get interested in languages and being a technical technological expert, and how did you get interested in linguistics?
Yeah, it's a really good question in English. I never answered it. So, sort of my classical answer was, my parents definitely had the interest, so part of it's that. My childhood, we didn't have a TV, and I didn't really have friends, so I basically, until I was older, now I don't have friends, so when I was a kid, my main free time was I just wander around in the forest and just sort of make noises to myself. I just loved sounds for some reason. My parents called me Jerome McBoing, which is a reference to some kid's book. But I just make sounds, and then when I was 9, they said, do you want to learn something outside of school? Like my older sister chose to learn sewing, and I said I wanted to learn German. So they're like, okay. So I started learning German when I was 9. And then high school, somehow my interest in languages just cemented, and I started learning Spanish and French then. And yeah, it's not quite clear where it came from, but just some sort of innate love of it. So I guess you may have noticed my BS, my bachelor's degree was called Symbolic Systems, which is this curious Stanford-specific major. But I think maybe it's really sort of what I always liked. Language is a system of symbols. Mathematics is a system of symbols. Those are both things I liked. There you go.
And machine learning,
it's very much focused only on artificial intelligence. And actually on my team, I'm one of the few people with linguistics background. So Ankur Bhatna was my co-author on this paper, and he's the other main person that I worked with together on this launch. He has no linguistics background, he's an excellent machine learning person. And I think it's almost by luck that I ended up on Translate. I also happen to be a linguist. And historically, in the last 10 years or so, there's a big movement against linguistics because people would they try to introduce linguistic knowledge and they sort of hinder the model actually because the machine can generally figure out the patterns better. There's some famous saying like, every time I fire a linguist, I gain 2 blue points, blue things. So but I think if applied correctly, and especially in the low resource setting, actually linguistic knowledge can be very helpful. If you try to manually design a bunch of things, then you'll get led into Maya and you'll actually hold your model back. But you let the model do everything it can, and then you also are carefully applying things on top, then it actually helps a lot.
And can you also tell us how we got interested in chromatic music? I play a bit of that myself, so I'm thinking how your interest got interested in that.
Silicon Valley.
What was that? Oh, Silicon Valley, yes. Well, it started with, here I'll go back to this picture in the beginning. So this is my singing group. When I went to Stanford, I loved singing, and I joined an a cappella group. And there are 10 a cappella groups in Stanford campus. And the one I joined was called Stanford Raga Kala, and it focused on Indian music, a lot of Bollywood music. And I joined it just for fun, basically. But every year, there were more and more people in the group who were classically trained musicians, and I got more and more fascinated through them. So pretty soon, my closest friend and roommate, Raman Nilekandi, he was trained in Carnatic music. So I got to know his family, and his little brother was also studying it. In grad school, I had a crush on a girl who studied Carnatic music. And more and more exposure. Every year I get more and more interested until by grad school, I was just trying to find YouTube recordings and just trying to memorize it, and then my friends would say, you have to pay more attention to the detail. Eventually I was complaining, I wish I could actually learn it, and then my friend said, you can. I said, what do you mean? What did you just learn? So she said, you can learn from my teacher in Sunnyvale. So for those of you who don't know, Sunnyvale it's in the Bay, and it's one of the most South Indian places outside of South India. So I actually started learning from the same teacher as my college roommate. So I was trained with the J.H.E. Bharadwaj, and he made for the Shri Rama Lali Rama School of Fine Arts. So yeah, man, I've been practicing theoretically an hour a day since then. It's getting close to half an hour, but I still do it. Currently learning a composition in Sanskrit. Yeah, there's just, for those people who are into music, there's just an ocean of delight, an ocean of knowledge. In Carnatic music, you can swim and never reach the shore, so it's quite wonderful. That's
Thank you, Mr. Caswell. I think your work will help people like Mr. Durga in a great way. And obviously, what you have told, swimming in the Ganasagar is no match. Ambassador would like to hand over a memento in appreciation of your work. That is just a small token of Thank you very much. On behalf of the embassy, I convey my heartfelt thanks to you for all your work, and also thanks to all these invitees who have spared so much time to be here, and also people who are also listening to us online through our Facebook. Thank you very much.